Thanks, Mr President. In moving this motion standing in my name, I wish to acknowledge the value and importance of such forums in supporting members of Parliament, both male and female, across the Pacific region, and the valuable work done by Australian and New Zealand parliaments in supportive and mentoring roles. In reality, the benefits are mutual, as we also have much to learn from our Pacific neighbours, and shared experiences will always be valuable learning opportunities. Mr President, I was fortunate to attend the 3rd Pacific Women's Parliamentary Partnerships Forum in Fiji at the end of April this year. It was particularly beneficial to reconnect with many of the female MPs from around the Pacific who had attended the previous forum and learn more about their progress, as well as the ongoing challenges within their jurisdictions. The amount of work to organise these forums by Fiona Way, the PWPP Project Manager from the Parliamentary Skills Centre of the Parliament of Australia, and her team is significant. And I acknowledge the work undertaken in the planning, implementation and operations that resulted in a very successful forum. This, of course, could not have been achieved without the ongoing funding support provided by the Australian Government through AusAid and the assistance and support of the Parliament of the Republic of Fiji. This program continues to support and promote gender equality in parliaments across the Pacific region, and much great work is going on to progress this work. It was very interesting to speak to many of the delegates about their experiences with the promotion of gender equality in their countries and the measures that have been taken to seek and achieve this. Some have commented on the use of quotas, others have targets, and others just keep chipping away as what in many cases is a strong patriarchal society, making small but important gains. Mr President, I've come to the belief over time, much deliberation and discussion and research, that quotas really are the best way to achieve gender equality, including in Australia. Now, Tasmania is a bit of a shining example, mate. We've got 2 new female MPs in the lower house, so it actually puts us up to quite a high percentage in terms of comparison across Australia. So that's happened since I actually moved to speak to this motion previously.
They must have realised. In fact, our Parliament, I believe, has more members, more female members percentage than any other Parliament within Australia.
Yes, yeah. So we are gradually, as I said, chipping away. But I do think, in terms of long-term sustainability of this approach, we need to have quotas are the way to go. Other people have different views on that, and we debated it quite strongly, I guess, in different forums and different places. But yeah, it's interesting that the Parliament that has the most female members, as I understand it still is the case in the world, is one, I challenge the member to try and guess it. I'm sure you wouldn't unless you know. It's Uganda. Uganda has 80% or thereabouts, or a bit over 80% women, female MPs. And it's not because all the men were killed during wars.
No.
Sorry?
That's not gender equality either.
No, it's not. But it's interesting that they've actually gone that far that way. So, yeah, it was just interesting that I'm talking about the number of women in it, but Uganda's the one with the most. So it's just an interesting fact. So, Mr. President, as I said, I know many will not agree with the quota system. Saying that we do not want women elected on the basis of gender alone. This really is a nonsense, as women constitute 50% of our population, and this must also mean that 50% of the population are just as capable and competent to represent the state and country at this level. And as the member for Berwick alluded, gender equality means gender equality. It can work both ways, and should be considered. The barriers to achieving this are often to achieving gender equality in representative roles such as we are often ingrained and covert, concealed for the convenience of others' benefit. I believe that once the quota system has achieved its purpose, within a short time it will become unnecessary and can then be removed, but only time will tell. The same applies to all positions of leadership in the corporate world, and it's time action was taken. There is a growing evidence base that supports the appointment of women to senior positions, with publicly listed companies doing better financially and functionally with female CEOs overall. It is time to take note of this evidence at a government level, as we all know that of government business and departments that do need to do better in these areas. And our government businesses within Tasmania are a very poor example of gender equality, with only one female CEO. We are seeing more females start to be put onto board positions, but we're still a long way behind. Mr President, to now speak more specifically to points 3 and 4 of the motion, members would be aware that the theme and focus of this year's forum was around family violence. This is an area that increased attention this year, partly as a result of Rosie Batty being named the Australian of the Year, and this has resulted in much needed and more timely focus on the scourge that is not only in our society but worldwide, and partly as this is often a hidden and taboo topic in many male-dominated patriarchal societies. Mr President, this important topic was discussed at length, and it was very pleasing to hear some of the programs that have been introduced in many countries, including Fiji. On the last day of the forum, we were fortunate to visit a nearby village to meet with some of the men and women of the village to discuss the Zero Tolerance to Violence program in their village. We were very warmly welcomed and had a very informative discussion with the men and the women of the village. We talked about a range of strategies they were using to deal with anger and to avoid violence. It was a very close community, and the children were on school holidays at the time, so a lot of the children were around as well. But it was really interesting being in the village and actually hearing both from the men and the women of their perspectives of how this was working. And this Zero Tolerance to Violence program has been rolled out around a number of the villages in Fiji, and they've actually got a sign out on the road leading into their village identifying them as such a village has taken on this initiative. The other thing that I found really interesting in this particular village was that not only was the decision taken to have the zero tolerance to violence, they'd also decided for everyone would give up smoking for 3 months. And they were very heavy smokers. A lot of the men predominantly were very heavy smokers, and they were just doing a cold turkey, so that was it. And they assured us that they hadn't had a cigarette in that time. It was nearly 3 months was almost up, and they were going to have no kava for 3 months as well. So another huge cultural change that was being undertaken as a part of this process. And when we asked about this, the women said that they felt very positive about the impacts that was having. I thought it's an interesting thing because giving up smoking, because that often can make people quite tense and anxious when you're actually giving up smoking, trying to avoid using violence as a remedy, and then no kava either, which tends to calm them down a bit. So it was a really interesting combination, but it seemed to be working. So no one had smoked or drunk kava over that time, and we asked them about how were they measuring the success of the implementation of this program, and one of the other measures they said is that no women had been taken to hospital as a result of violence during this time. It's a pretty serious measure, isn't it? I mean, that's the measure, that women end up in hospital as a result of violence. So it clearly doesn't mean that violence wasn't still occurring at perhaps a lower level, but no women had been taken to hospital. So if that's the measure, it makes you think about how do you actually impact at a sort of a lower level and even raise it, or take it down to where the lesser harmful acts of violence, they don't leave physical injuries to the same degree. How do you manage with that as well? Mr President, the program was supported by the Fiji government with health workers involved, and as I said, it was being adopted in several villages. So they had a health worker dedicated to the village to help educate and support the village through that. And as I said, both all the men and women were very positive about the progress and early success of the program. So, Mr President, I'd now like to read into Hansard the outcome statement from the forum, as this covers very well all the aspects of the forum. Members will need to bear with me, and I do apologise to Hansard, but I will provide Hansard with the correct pronunciations and spellings at a later time of the names of many of the participants, which are a bit beyond me probably getting right. So, Mr President, I quote from the outcome statement that was the result of the forum. Women members of the Pacific Parliament met in Suva, Fiji on 29 April to the 1st of May 2015 to renew friendships and discuss their work as parliamentarians. The forum's focus in 2015 was on the theme of family violence in the region. The forum included 63 parliamentarians and participants from 15 jurisdictions, including Cook Islands, Federated States of Micronesia, Fiji, Kiribati, Marshall Islands, Nauru, Niue, Palau, Papua New Guinea, Samoa, Solomon Islands, Tonga, Vanuatu, Australia and New Zealand. The forum was coordinated by the Australian Parliament with the financial support of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade under the Pacific Women Shaping Pacific Women Shaping Pacific Development initiative. The forum took place with the invaluable support and gracious hosting of the Honourable Dr. Giko Levini, Speaker of the Parliament of the Republic of Fiji, and a Ministry of Support from the Parliament Secretariat. On behalf of the Speaker, Ms Vinana, and I apologise, I can't actually pronounce her surname, the Secretary-General to the Parliament, she welcomed participants to the forum and introduced the Honourable Rear Admiral J.V. Bainimarama, Prime Minister of the Republic of Fiji, who presented the opening address. The Prime Minister said that family violence is a vitally important issue and a test of values. It is not acceptable and perpetrators should be subject to the full force of the law. The Prime Minister encouraged the forum to send a strong message to the world that family violence is a matter for public discussion in Pacific society. So, Mr President, just deviating from the outcome statement, the President's speech was very encouraging and very inspiring, particularly when you know the history of Fiji. So it was really great to have Prime Minister Bainimarama there and speaking with such conviction and strength to addressing the really big challenge of domestic violence in Fiji, but also acknowledging that it happens all around the region, including in our own country. So back to the outcome statement, Mr President. The Honourable Murray Tekani from the Parliament of Kiribati thanked the Prime Minister and the Speaker for their welcome. Ms Natasha Stott-Despoja, AM, Australian Ambassador for Women and Girls, responded. She thanked the Prime Minister and the Speaker for their welcome, noting that the World Health Organisation has called family violence an epidemic and that it remains a global and regional challenge. Ms Stott-Despoja congratulated Pacific Island parliaments which had legislated to criminalise family violence. She noted, however, that impunity persists despite the range of legislative and program initiatives around the region in recent years. Ms. I don't know how to pronounce it, Mr President. A former Tongan diplomat and Deputy Speaker of the Secretariat of the Pacific Community spoke about family violence in the Pacific context, noting that was one of the pervasive indicators of gender inequality and has a direct impact on productivity and a serious indirect impact as fear of violence may mean people do not seek access to education. She reported that the economic cost of family violence is considered to be approximately 3% of GDP, and that childhood experience of family violence may be repeated from generation to generation, growing exponentially. Legislative measures are often piecemeal and progress was hampered by the absence of data and monitoring systems to assess measures taken. Legislators need to be sensitised to the issues so that they can support change. Discussion followed, considering rape in marriage, the role of the Church in addressing violence against women, how media deals with the issue, and the inclusion of family values and life skills as part of the school curriculum. A plenary session involving Ms Maha Muna from the United Nations Population Fund and Ms Melissa Alvarado from the United Nations Women addressed the issue of data on family violence and the importance of reliable research, including what constitutes violence against women and why data is collected. Ms Muna noted the different types of violence against women and the issues associated with societies with high rates of family violence. Prevalence data needs to be collected to understand the magnitude of the problem and address it effectively. Ms Muna outlined the methodology used for prevalence studies and the need for research protocols and guidelines because of the sensitive nature of the collection. The variation of family violence across countries implies that violence against women is not inevitable. Ms Alvarado addressed the need for more coherent and coordinated responses to family violence across agencies to reduce duplication, reduce costs and maintain synergies. She reported on the findings of a large study across Asia and the Pacific considering why rape occurs. The data revealed the risk factors and how services and systems need to be modified to improve responses. Prevalence studies have shown that women are afraid of shame and blame, few report violence, and few seek help from service providers. Lack of confidentiality discourages reporting. There is no template response, but violence is preventable, the silence needs to be broken, and survivors need a supportive community. And Mr President, just off the outcome statement for a moment, that's what we're hearing now, particularly with the focus that the government is taking on addressing, our government, Tasmanian government, are focusing on addressing family violence. But I do again take it back to the work that, that Rosie Batty, being the Australian of the Year, has really shone the spotlight on this right around Australia and certainly around the Pacific region. So, Mr President, to quote the outcome statement again, a panel session on family violence, legislation and regulation in the region, chaired by Ama from Samoa, involved an outline of international standards and best practice, with parliamentarians outlining the range of legislation and regulation and practices across jurisdictions. Challenges include the content and interpretation of legislation, context and the resources that will to implement legislation. Gender equality law reform is a long process. It must be sustainable. The impact of drugs and alcohol on family violence was noted. The role of legislators was considered in the second panel session, chaired by the Honourable Hilda Heaney from the Marshall Islands. 6 parliamentarians outlined the legislative approach in their jurisdictions, noting the challenges when resources were inadequate to enforce legislation, and that the problem of family violence is growing, even in the face of enforcement measures, including support for survivors and rehabilitation measures for perpetrators. The focus should be on what is best for the survivors of family violence. The next panel session, chaired by Dr Lavini, considered engagement with stakeholders, civil society, churches, NGOs, government and other parliamentarians, as well as lobbying for resources. The session began with a film demonstrating a Fijian initiative on family violence, a zero violence tolerance program that villagers could register for and which required them to undergo lengthy training. This is the village that we visited, one of the villages that we visited at the end of the forum. So to quote again, Mr President, once declared a zero tolerance village, a gatekeeping committee of residents monitors violence in the village. And just by the way, Mr President, in these villages, any raised voices will be heard throughout the community. They're all very close together. The houses, they're only made of thin timber and that sort of thing. So if there was to be a dispute, you couldn't have a shouting match and not be noticed. So it wouldn't be too hard to monitor in terms of having a gatekeeper or gatekeeping committee aspects of violence as they may occur. So, Mr President, to quote again, panel members referred to experiences in their jurisdictions, including the importance of considering the welfare of children before they are born, acknowledging that alliances with different stakeholders can be highly valuable, the empowerment of women, bilateral relationships with donors, developing platforms for election that include addressing family violence, the use of parliamentary committees and groups, being specific in allocating budgets to address family violence, questioning budget allocations in Parliament and promoting gender-sensitive training in parliaments. In panel sessions 4, chaired by the Honourable Sharman Stone MP from Australia, parliamentarians considered what happens at the implementation stage of legislation that passes and recognise that although bills addressing family violence are gaining support, implementation of support services and solutions to the underlying problems are falling short. Dr Stone highlighted the need to seek support from the private sector as well as government. The final panel session considered how parliamentarians can hold governments accountable. Mr Harry Jenkins, AO, yes, a male, but we did have male male members of Parliament in the final session. Mr Harry Jenkins, AO, chaired the session and emphasised that it was important for parliamentarians to know more about UN conventions on human rights and the obligations that governments have in upholding these. There was discussion of the difficulty that some countries faced in accessing reports regarding measures towards UN treaties and what incentives might help communities to strive toward important improvements. Discussion turned to work that cross-party parliamentary committees can do in holding governments to account, as well as the complexity of the issue and how much more work should be done on prevention of the problem rather than just in services for victims. And Mr President, I think this is an important thing that the Premier is considering at the moment and the government, and it's not just providing services to victims that are important, it's looking at the cause of the problem and preventing the cause, which is a huge problem and will obviously require a lot of thinking about and probably more funding. over time, and a lot of money's been committed, but I'm sure that won't meet every need. So, Mr President, the draft priorities that were agreed at the forum, and I quote these as well, the agreed priorities for the Pacific Parliaments are scoping and prioritising the problem, data, so facing the issue and ending the silence. The forum agreed on the need for research and data that equip legislators to understand the nature and extent of the problem in each jurisdiction, why victims do not seek help or report family violence, and why existing legislative and policy responses are not achieving the targeted outcomes. Adequate collection and analysis of prevalence data provides the basis and authority for allocating resources to address family violence and the practice of shaming and blaming its victims. Second priority, addressing the problem, legislation and gender budgeting. Recognising that family violence is a human rights issue and has significant direct and indirect economic, social and cultural impacts on Pacific nations, the forum agreed on the need to prioritise legislative approaches by auditing the diversity and coherence of legislation and regulations that address family violence and monitoring their implementation in order to ensure that it is adequate, comprehensive and effectively resourced, including through an application of gender budgeting mechanisms. The forum noted that the application forms for donor assistance be simplified and more user-friendly, and that the criteria more flexible and less complex. The third priority, streamlining responses, engaging with stakeholders. Acknowledging that legislators must work with stakeholders to coordinate services dealing with family violence, the forum agreed that legislators need to identify all relevant stakeholders, including church and traditional leaders, NGOs, government agencies and the police, health, education and justice systems. This builds on the agreed PWPP priority in 2014 to develop robust mechanisms and partnerships that will enable separate and often fragmented resources to be integrated and harnessed to bring about more streamlined services that protect survivors and bring perpetrators to account. The fourth priority, overcoming discriminatory stereotypes, sensitising legislators, public and the media. Building on the PWPP Forum's agreed priority in 2014, developing and implementing a strategy for ongoing gender equality and equity training for all parliamentarians and parliamentary staff, the Forum recognised the need for legislators to receive training to sensitise them to the scope, causes and effects of family violence and encourage men and women legislators to work together to pursue legislative reform, work effectively with key stakeholders, challenge gender stereotyping in society, especially that of the media, and hold governments to account in complying with international and regional commitments to gender equality. Fifth priority, gender-sensitive cross-party groups. Building on the PWPP Forum's agreed priority for 2014 to create gender-sensitive cross-party parliamentary groups responsible for ensuring that the Parliament raises gender equality issues in legislation, the Forum agreed that in each Parliament such a body should ensure that awareness of family violence in the Pacific region is raised as a matter of urgency, and that the scope of the issue is understood by legislators and the Parliaments encourage sharing of lessons learned. The sixth priority, addressing children's needs. Remembering the childhood experience of family violence is a risk factor for intergenerational violence and that children are profoundly affected by family violence. The Forum agreed that participants would urge their education ministers to ensure that the school curricula supports girls and boys by teaching them life skills that build emotional resilience and healthy and respectful family relationships. And 7, Mr President, the Forum urges all Pacific Parliaments to engage in actions and work towards the above priorities. So, Mr President, and that's the end of the quote. Mr President, I think we all have an obligation to consider these matters in our own states, but also to be aware of some of the challenges facing our Pacific neighbours. Some of them who come from very small jurisdictions, some of them are quite patriarchal in their approach, and in many cases we need to learn from each other. I mean, being there as a participant, I learnt a significant amount from the Pacific women who do some amazing things and have got some really great programs in place. And I think they can learn from some of the things we do. They were quite interested in our safe at home legislation, how that actually worked. And so we can all learn from each other, but we need to share our learnings and not think we all need to reinvent the wheel. And when we find something that might work or does work, then share it, and not think we have to really reinvent everything to fit our own needs. Of course, there are cultural differences that need to be recognised, and that can never be overlooked. But when it comes down to it, violence is violence, regardless of your culture, and it's not acceptable. So, Mr President, I believe the outcome statement provided a very comprehensive summary of the proceedings of the forum. It was a really full few days, the trip to the village wasn't actually planned as part of the forum, but because we had about an hour spare at the end of the day, one day, because the flight wasn't leaving until the next morning, we were able to they were able to arrange that, which we really appreciate that opportunity to go and visit a neighbouring village. So, Mr President, I believe this clearly illustrates the benefits of such forums, and I hope to be able to attend future forums to follow up with our Pacific sisters as we tackle this major challenge together and continue to learn from each other. The forum was very timely, appropriate and beneficial, and I note again the work of Ms Fiona Ray and her team and the ongoing financial support provided through the AusAid program and the support of the Australian and New Zealand governments. I note that. Move the motion.
Question is the motion be agreed